hello everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Let's get started. So I'd like to start off by saying that I'm an entrepreneur, and like many entrepreneurs, I'm constantly hit by new ideas that I want to act on. But something I've learned along the years is that while ideas are cheap, acting on them is quite expensive. I started my last company with just the spark of an idea, and before I knew it, years had passed. Of all the resources we have at our disposal, time is our most valuable asset. While other resources like money and people fluctuate up and down, time only moves in one direction. The biggest cost that we face isn't even the physical cost of building products. We all know most products, the odds of building products are stacked against us, but the biggest risk that we face is the opportunity cost, the risk that after all this work you put in, you build a product that nobody wants. It was this realization that prompted me to start my own search for a better, faster way for vetting ideas, which I'll share with you today. So as Yasmina said, we do have a Q&A going, and I like to keep these as conversational as possible. So as I'm presenting, if you have any questions that hit you, don't wait till the end, just ask it, and I'll take frequent breaks to check the Q&A and answer them as I go along. So I'm going to start by defining what running lean is. So if you have any questions along the way, just keep them coming. So I already kind of hit on the point that most products fail, and this is nothing new. I'm sure that many of you in the audience already know that. The more interesting statistic, though, is that 2/3 of the companies that actually succeed report having drastically changing their plans along the way. So what they start out initially to build is not really where they end up, not really what became their viable business model. And so what that tells us is that starting with that initial plan is not really the objective. It's more about finding a plan that works, and the key part here is before running out of resources. Now, up until now, finding that better plan, sometimes it's a B, or sometimes it's a C or a Z, has been based more on gut intuition and luck. There's been no systematic process for going from that initial plan to one that works, and that is what really running lean and even the lean startup methodology is really about. It's about going from that initial plan to one that works before running out of resources. So running lean itself is a product of first-hand learning from building dozens of products, both my own and working alongside other entrepreneurs. It's a synthesis of several methodologies. 3 of the most important ones are customer development, lean startup, and bootstrapping. I'm not going to go into details on each one, but I will summarize a key takeaway from each one so that you kind of get a feeling of what the core is about. So customer development is a term that was coined by Steve Blank. For many of you that don't know who he is, he's a seasoned entrepreneur in his own right, has started several companies. Now he teaches at Stanford and Berkeley. And one of the things that he observed along the way is that we spend a disproportionate amount of time in product development and not nearly enough doing customer development. And what he essentially means by that is we spend at the tail end of the product development cycle gathering requirements, understanding what it is we need to build, and then we go away for several weeks, months, sometimes even years at a time without interacting nearly enough with customers, only to find out that when we actually release our products, we've been led astray. We've actually built too much, or we've built the wrong product, and there's no market for the product that we had envisioned at the start of the process. And so he calls for this mantra of getting out of the building, of trying to create a feedback loop with your customers, not just during the initial phases of a product life cycle and not only after you launch that product, but throughout that product development life cycle. And we'll talk about how we actually do those kinds of things. The other big influence on running lean has been lean startup. This is a term that was coined by Eric Ries, and like me, he was a technical founder. We have similar backgrounds in that he built software, subscribed to a lot of the agile and extreme programming types of practices. He also had a deep interest in lean manufacturing, which is where the word lean actually comes from. So a lot of people misunderstand lean and equate it with being cheap, And while that's not a complete misrepresentation, because from the original lean thinking, what we're really trying to do is be as efficient as possible with resources. Money happens to be one of those resources, but it's not what being a lean startup is really about. So in a lean startup, there's this big idea of iteration and really of short iterations, trying to fit in as much learning into these iterations as possible before we run out of resources. And I'll give some more examples of these. But a very succinct definition of what a lean startup is, in my mind, is it's a company that tries to maximize learning about customers per unit time. So it's all about maximizing learning and not about building stuff faster or being efficient with money. But talking about money, the next big influence that I've had in my own career as an entrepreneur has been bootstrapping. So I bootstrapped my last company, and a lot of people automatically equate bootstrapping with financing. And some people look at bootstrapping as self-funding. A more accurate definition might be funding with customer revenues. But I subscribe to an even more philosophical definition of bootstrapping that was put forward by my friend Bijoy, who's also in Austin, Texas, and the founder of the Bootstrapper Network here. And several years ago, he coined this mantra of right action, right time. And what he really meant by it is that as entrepreneurs, we are constantly bombarded with 100 things to do every single day. But at any point in time, there are only a few key actions that truly matter. And that's what our job is. We have to ignore everything else and focus just on those things. And even if you look at some of the great bootstrap companies, they've all gone, well, not all, but many of them have gone and actually raised financing. So it's not just limited to financing. It's really a way of thinking. And to me, that is what I take out of bootstrapping, and you'll see that reflected in some of the slides later on. All right, so what I'm going to do now is spend some time covering the running lean from a high level, from a 3,000-foot overview. And as Yasmina mentioned, there are going to be a number of webcasts to follow this one. And so my goal today is to really lay the principles behind running lean and illustrate it with an example at the end. And then in subsequent webcasts, I'm going to dive deeper into some of these tactics and techniques and share that with you. So I always get asked the question of where this came from, and does it really apply just to software startups? Does it really apply, or does it apply to a wider spectrum of products? And what I've found over the years, and what I tell people, is that you can separate certain meta principles out of this body of work, and I find those to be universal. I find those to apply to a great many products, if not all kinds of products. But the specific tactics for taking these principles to actions are very different based on the kind of product you're building. And so I'll kind of draw that difference right up here. And so what we're going to be talking about today are the core principles, and I will illustrate them with some examples along the way. And as I said, in subsequent workshops, we can get into even more specific tactics. So jumping right in, the first principle from running lean is that of documenting your plan A. So as I mentioned from the start, our goal as entrepreneurs is to find a plan that works before running out of resources. And it's very important as a first step to not only document this plan, but to share it with at least one other person. And the big reason for that is because of this right here, is that as entrepreneurs, we are especially gifted at creating reality distortion fields around ourselves. We can rationalize anything. When things are going great, it's because of the feature we just pushed out or because of the product we just built. When things aren't going so great, there's always a reason why. And so it's very important for us to be very clear and very upfront about what our hypotheses are and documenting them in such a way so that we actually learn from the outcome of each one. And I'll touch on this a little bit more. Now, traditionally, business plans have been used for that purpose. The whole idea of the business plan is for the entrepreneur to go away and really spend time and critically think through their product and document these hypotheses. Now, typically when I run these talks with the live audience, I ask people to raise their hands if they've ever written a business plan before, and a number of hands go up. and then I follow with a question of how many people actually enjoy that process. And most of the hands, not all of them, but most of them go down. And that is very typical because business plans are a painful process. It's an exercise that many investors make you do, but they themselves don't take the time to read the document because it is this big document. It's hard to get your head around it. And so while the exercise is sound of making entrepreneurs go through this critical thinking exercise, the format is completely wrong. It's just too big of a document. It takes too long to write, and some of the requirements quickly break down into more of a fiction than actual fact. And that's one of the reasons why most entrepreneurs today don't even write business plans. They only do it unless they're actually asked to. And so the alternative, and something that I'm going to present here today, is the business model. And this is a single diagram of your business. And it looks something like this. So I know that a number of you have probably seen something, either seen this exact version or something similar to this. This is the lean canvas format that I adopted from Alex Osterwalder's original business model canvas, which some of you, as I said, might have seen already. And again, I'm not going to jump into a lot of these boxes today, but the key point that I want to make here is that this captures a lot of the essence of what goes into a business plan anyways. Now, some of the obvious advantages of using a simple one-page format like this one is that it's very fast to create. You can create one of these things in really 15 or 20 minutes. The second thing is that because it is such a short one-page document, when you put it in front of somebody, it is bound to get read, and you're going to get feedback, good or bad. You're going to get feedback, and that to me is the real essence or the real reason why we should be writing business plans or writing our assumptions down, is we want to really get out of our comfort zone and go test these ideas with other people first. And so that's what the lean canvas format is. Another key takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is something that I did on purpose, and that is the solution box that you see here. I purposely made it very small. And the reason for that is that as entrepreneurs, we are naturally inclined to get most passionate about our solutions. Typically, when we get hit by an idea, the first thing we want to do is go build it. And that usually is a mistake. And part of the reason for that is that in the world that we live in today, with the internet, with cloud computing, with open source, we can build almost any product we want to today. And that's not really the problem. In fact, we're actually building more products than we have ever done in history. But unfortunately, the odds of building these successful products haven't gone up. And I think the reason is because we rush into building these products, and it's not that we don't build what we set out to build, but we build something that nobody really wants. And so the key point of this slide is that there is more to the product than just the solution. Your solution is not the product of your startup. It is the entire business plan or the entire business model. And so the way I like to think of the business model is like a product. And our job as entrepreneurs is to take these distinct pieces of the business model and make them fit together. And when they actually fit together, we have got this plan that is starting to work. Now thinking of a product, actually at this point I'll probably just take a peek at the questions to see if there are any questions before I move on. I see a question about Lean Launchpad at Stanford. I don't know if whoever asked that question, if you could clarify what you mean by that. I know there is a Lean Launchpad at Stanford run by Steve Blank, but maybe you have something more specific in mind. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, and I'll kind of check the questions in a little bit later. So as I was saying, thinking of your business model like a product was particularly empowering for me, being a technical product guy, because it allowed me to apply a lot of the same techniques we do to building products to the business plan or to the business model. So if you actually look at the problem of building a product or building a startup, it's a very complex problem. And one of the things from the product development playbook is that of divide and conquer. We take a big problem, we break it up into distinct pieces, and then we tackle each one individually. And that to me is pretty much what the lean canvas really does. It takes the problem of the business model and it breaks it into these 9 distinct boxes that we can very clearly identify and isolate and be able to break it up into these distinct pieces that we then tackle systematically. And then the other technique that we take out from the product development playbook is that of tackling the riskiest parts first. So as I mentioned, for most products, not all, there are some products that do have a lot of technical risk, but for a lot of products, our solution is really not what's risky, and so that may not be the optimal place to really start testing your business model. What we instead want to do is identify what is risky on that model and start by testing those first. And so, and in my mind, building a successful product is all about risk mitigation. Our true job as entrepreneurs is not as much about building the product as it is about de-risking our product along the way. And I'll illustrate that with a few visuals from the lean canvas. And so what I show here are customers. Now, when customers look at your lean canvas, now they're not going to look at your lean canvas, but when they look at your product or what you're doing, they're not automatically drawn to your solution. What's really going on in their mind is, are you building something for them? The first thing they want to know is the identity. And so one of the things we talk a lot about is being able to have a clear understanding of who your customer segments are, and specifically who your early adopters are. What do they look like? What are their motivations? What are they really looking to get solved? What problems are they looking to get solved? So that's the first thing that customers typically tend to think about before they part with their hard-earned cash. The second thing they're going to be looking at is the benefit. What is that unique value proposition? So we live in an increasingly product-oriented world. We're constantly bombarded by products all the time, online, offline, on TV, everywhere. And so when customers look at your product, what they want to know is, what is the value that you are really providing them? What is that number one problem that they have that they want solved that you are addressing? And so that's what they look at when they look at your product or your startup. And then finally, once they connect once the product connects with them and they understand the benefit, then of course things like price come into question. So these are the top 3 things that I kind of prioritize in terms of what customers look at when they look at your product. Now, if you flip this over to the investor side, again, when investors are evaluating a company, they're not, again, as interested in the solution. Now, it definitely helps if they've got similar interests. They're not interested in the customer segments directly, but rather one of the most important things that they're actually looking for is traction. And as I show in the Venture Hacks code below, traction matters above everything else. And if you've got a product that's getting good traction, you can almost always convince the right investor to write you a check. If you don't quite have that, then there are usually other proxies that come into play. But provided you have some early traction, again, the investor's mind doesn't go into what is the solution, what are you building, but what they then look at is, what are the margins of the product. So down in the canvas below, you have your cost structure on the left and the revenue stream on the right. The intersection of the two is where the viability of the business model really comes out from. So when investors look at this, what they're looking at, if you've got good traction, is this really a business model that can potentially work? Is this really one that can potentially scale in the future? And then they don't directly care about customers, but what they do care about is, how big is this market? So the customers you're going after, what market size do they represent? And is this, again, going to be a scalable model or not? And then finally, if all of those kind of check off, one of the common questions is around competitive advantage or defensibility of your solution. Who is the competition and what's going to make you be able to execute this plan better than anyone else? Now, all of these things that I put on here are all are risks that we have to overcome systematically over time. And they're not things that we necessarily have to tackle from day one. Some of these things, especially things like defensibility and unfair advantage, I found are things that not many people have in day one. And so there's a time and place to tackle each one of these. And so what I'm going to do next is really share the 3 stages of a startup, which doesn't necessarily talk about all these risks, but it talks about the goals that we have to overcome as entrepreneurs in each of these stages, and they typically then drive what those risks are that we should be focusing on. So the first stage here is called the problem solution fit stage, and our basic objective here is to find a problem worth solving. So when you get hit by that initial idea, rather than rushing into building something, what I recommend that you do instead is spend a little bit of time in this problem solution fit stage to try to evaluate if you really have a problem worth solving. Now, the way that I subscribe doing this is by spending a little bit of time trying to identify who those customers are. So creating a lean canvas, being able to document those hypotheses, and then going out, and the first step is really understanding the problem, whether you do that through observation, so observing where customers where customers interact, how they behave, or even through a formal interview process where you actually go out and interview customers to really understand if the problems that you are trying to address are problems they face today, and more importantly, try to understand how they solve those problems today. And out of those, there are a whole bunch of things that fall out, specifically things like competition. Typically, as entrepreneurs, we tend to make these bullet lists of who we think our competitors are, but it's really the customers that have to define who our competition is. If they don't know the competition that you list, then they really aren't. And many times the reverse is also true. They actually use alternatives. Things like email tends to be a common alternative for many products that is not really one that we typically list as competition. So the whole idea of that first set of interviews or observation exercises is to really understand the problem. And then once we have a good understanding of the problem, we then follow with a demo. So even here, we don't actually go out and build the entire product because that will take too much time. What we want to do is create just enough of a demo to basically help customers visualize the problem that we're trying to solve and then measure their reaction to it. And this, if you're charging for your product, is sometimes also a good time to test pricing. And I detail a lot of these concepts and techniques in the book in much more detail. But at the end of that process, what you should end up with is a determination of whether you have a problem worth solving. So there are three things you're looking for. It's a clear definition of who the customer is an understanding of how they solve these problems today and whether that problem is really worth solving in their minds. And then three, if you are pricing this product, being able to have some idea from their existing alternatives what they're paying to solve this problem today is a good way to give you that understanding of what that pricing will be. And from there, you actually derive the minimum feature set that you use to then build this product, and what we in the lean startup world call the minimum viable product. Now, once you have that, we actually launch that, and we go into that second stage. And so this is where we have built our minimum feature set, this minimum viable product. We launch it with these customers, many of whom we have interviewed in that first stage. And what we want to do in the second stage is measure whether we have built something people want. And so when we first launch a product, lots of things can and do go wrong along the way. And so the process, the goal in this stage is really a process of iteration where we're trying to improve the product to a point where customers can actually realize the value proposition that we promised in that first stage. And once you get to that point, and once you have enough people using that, and there are both qualitative and quantitative ways for measuring what we'd call early traction or early product market fit, once you get to that point, you've actually guaranteed some level of success because you have built something enough people want, and they're coming and using your product and giving you valuable testimonials along the way. At that point, your objective then shifts into that third stage, which is to scale the business. And so up until now, we have done a number of things to make sure that we are on the path of building a product that is going to work or that's starting to work. And at this stage, our focus then shifts towards accelerating that plan. So everything up until now was finding that plan that could possibly work, and now we shift into a stage where we want to accelerate that plan, and that's the final scale stage. So let me jump up and see if there are any questions so far. There are a number of them. Let's see. What do you find to be the best method to contact, reach out to potential customers to validate the problem solution? So I would almost say if you have an existing channel to customers today, which not everyone does, but if you have one that you're going to be using to get to that product, that you're going to use to get the product out anyways, by all means, it's obviously a given that you would start with that one. But if you don't have that, I would recommend just using even a qualitative interview process where you go out and you reach out to your first degree network, and you use the first degree network to find other people that might be 2 or 3 degrees out that you can use to be able to set up these interviews with and go talk to them. And so in the initial stages, we're going to be riddled a lot by qualitative learning. And as you'll find is that even that yields a lot of learning. So there are many who feel that they're trying to build this product for thousands of customers. Talking to just 10 or 20 people is not going to reveal any big insights. And you'll be surprised how much that is untrue. So if you're trying to build a product, if you're trying to build a new product, bring something new to the market, our biggest challenge isn't actually selling the product, but actually getting noticed in the first place. And so through this whole process of the interviews that I described here, that's where that learning helps a lot and helps you actually identify where your business model hypotheses are and which ones are going to are going to require you to actually spend more time than others. Let me see if I can take one more question and then I'll continue on. Don't you think there should be a block in the lean canvas for risks? So I tend to look at all the blocks in the lean canvas as risks, and so it's not really. I don't find it necessarily important to have a specific risks box, but I think that every one of those hypotheses that we put here represent a risk. So if you have a hypothesis where you think that moms are going to be your target segment, that is a risk that you have to go validate. And one way to do it is to set up these interviews and see if they have this problem that you think they do. And so every one of these blocks are representative of risks that we systematically validate over time. All right, so let me get back, and then I'll try to jump back and answer as many more of these questions after the second stage. So we have talked about creating this initial lean canvas or this initial plan A. We've talked about identifying risks that are important to you. And as I mentioned, some of these risks are dependent by stage. Some of them are going to be dependent even by the products that you build. So for some products, pricing is a very big risk. For others, it's not. And I'll illustrate that with an example here shortly. But once you have done that, we then go into this stage of systematically testing the plan. And up until now, I've been using a lot of terms. I've been using a lot of scientific terms like hypothesis, and another term that we commonly throw around in the lean startup world is an experiment. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing what that is. So for those of you that might be familiar with lean startups, this is the build, measure, learn loop that Eric Ries drew several years ago, and it basically summarizes what an experiment is about. So at the very top, we have ideas or hypotheses of things. These could be features, these could be product ideas, and then we spend some time building some kind of an artifact. On this slide you see product, but I actually have a much more loose definition here where the product could actually be a screenshot, it could be a video, it could be a drawing of what it is you're trying to do. Just anything that can help you, that can help customers visualize what the product is going to be. Once you have that, we put it in front of customers and we measure their reaction to this product, both qualitatively through interviews as well as quantitatively through metrics or other means. And once we gather up this data, we then analyze it, and what we want to do at the end of that is learn from that process. And that learning is what fuels the loop and allows us to go around this loop as many times as possible. So because it's very critical for us to find this plan that works before running out of resources, which is usually the reasons why most startups fail, we know that speed or loop is pretty important. The other thing that is very important at the end of every one of these loops is we have to end up with a learning outcome. Basically, at the end of every one of these loops, we have to end up with a learning deliverable. And so it's not as much about learning about how to build better products, how to write defect-free code, but what we want to do at the end of it is learn something about customers, how they reacted to our product, and that's what we want to measure at the end of the loop. Now, something that doesn't get nearly enough attention is focus. At the very top, when we're actually coming up with these ideas and hypotheses, we have to be very clear about which ones we want to test first. And so again, the whole question of the risks, I look at everything on the canvas as being risky, but what is most risky varies by stage and varies by product. And what we want to do is focus on those and try to eliminate those risks first before going down the path of building out other things in our product roadmap. And to kind of illustrate the whole speed learning focus loop, what I'm going to do here is talk about what happens when you don't quite have all three of these things. And so if you're pretty much running fast and you're focused on something, but you're not learning about customers, this is a common trap that we fall into, where we're spending a lot of time building new features. We're chasing after particular feature requests, but if you're not actually learning, if you're not closing that loop with learning about what's working and what's not, the image of a dog chasing its tail comes to mind. And so that's the trap that we fall into when we're not learning as a result of our experiments. Now, if on the other hand, we are actually learning a lot about customers and we're super focused on the right things, but we're not going fast enough, that's where we run into the danger of either running out of resources or potentially being even outpaced by another competitor. And that's a real problem that we also face as entrepreneurs. And finally, this is one of the more common ones that I've seen, I've found myself in, and I've seen many people in this boat, where if you're not focused on the right things, if we are learning about customers and we're going fast, but we're not focused on the right things, we get into the trap of premature optimization. So for the technical folks out there, this would be a scenario where you obsess over server scalability before you launch, only to find that once you launch, you only have a handful of customers, and so all that work was really for nothing. So that's a common trap we run into. And for the marketing folks out there, this is again a trap where we might spend a lot of time spent optimizing landing pages even before we have built our products. And so even though you might have a very efficient landing page to product conversion, if you don't quite have a product at the end that delivers on value or that even exists, it's actually a trap that you can fall into, where you can spend too much time becoming an SEO expert or trying to optimize your landing page to a point where that is not effort that was really well spent at that point. So hopefully this illustrates the speed learning and focus through this Venn diagram. And when I'm looking at running experiments, when I'm looking at prioritizing risks, I kind of look at it through this lens. And what we want to do is maximize for all three. We want to go as fast as possible. We want to be focused on the right things. And we want to know what it is we want to learn both at the beginning and at the end. We have to make sure that we can close that loop and have a learning. And even if we invalidate a hypothesis, that's perfectly fine. And I'll spend more time talking about hypotheses and particularly falsifiable hypotheses in a later webcast. So this one slide is going to summarize the running lean roadmap kind of in a visual. So on the left-hand side, I show the document your plan A step. And what I'm showing here are a number of lean canvases. Now, the reason I show a number of them is, as I mentioned early on, one of the benefits of a lean canvas is that it is a very small document. It's a very fast and simple thing to do. And so rather than spending time just creating one of these, I actually recommend people spend time creating alternatives or variations of their business model. Because you'll find with just a few tweaks, sometimes if you actually just tweak the customer segment, your entire canvas can change entirely. And the whole process of this exercise, it is a brainstorming exercise. And what we're trying to do here is really cast a wider net. So if you prematurely rush into implementing just one plan, we can many times fall into the trap that we like to call the local maxima problem, which for those of you that are computer scientists is also the hill climbing algorithm problem. And so this is where if we pick a particular business model to optimize, we can get into the trap of spending a lot of effort just trying to optimize a plan that may be suboptimal at the end. And so what we want to do initially is really take this broader sweep. And so if I'm building a file sharing product that might be geared at graphic designers, but could potentially also be used by construction, in the construction industry by architects, it could maybe be used in the medical industry. Rather than picking any one of those, I might spend a little bit of time talking to all of them or exploring all of them before I actually decide which one to go tackle head on. And so as a process of this exercise, once you create these canvases, one of the steps is laying them side by side and then prioritizing which ones to work on. And I talk about ways of prioritizing these canvases, both with yourself, with your team, as well as with your advisors. Now, at the end of that exercise, you might outright eliminate some canvases because they're given your own constraints, given who you are, that may not be the product that you want to build, or that may not be a market that you can reach at this particular point in time. But that exercise was still valuable in identifying what those other markets might be. Now, once you have done that first stage, the second stage is then the identification of risks. So we then look at those canvases, and depending on the product you're building, and if you're starting out, what you want to do is identify what is most risky about this plan. Is it really technical risk, or is it something else? Is it price? Maybe it might be channels. It might be that you have to reach thousands of people in a fairly short amount of time, and that might be something you have to go validate first before even building the product. So those are the kind of thinking that we do at this stage. Now, once we have our risks identified, we then go into the experimentation phase. And so I'm not going to detail a lot of what goes on here. I've already talked about some of these things. The first step is really running some of these interviews to understand what the problem is. As a result of that, you might eliminate some of these canvases. And so I do show some of these canvases being tested in parallel, which is also fairly common. So it is easy enough to set up interviews with multiple customer segments. And so what we want to do here is go and see, in that example I gave, if the graphical designer market is really more receptive to the product that we're trying to build versus the architects. And if that is the case, I might eliminate the architects because maybe I don't have enough of a channel to get to them, or maybe they have more objections than I originally thought. So there are just different ways for you to take that learning and begin to hone in on a single canvas at the end that you're going to be focused on optimizing. Now, once you understand the problem, we go through the solution testing phase, and this is where you might create some kind of a demo to put in front of the customers. You might test pricing with them, get some commitments as a result of that. And then there are two final stages where we test our products both qualitatively, and what I mean by that is at small scale, at micro scale. Rather than trying to do a big launch of something that is yet untested, what we might want to do is test it with our early adopters, preferably those we've actually interviewed along the way, and make sure that, one, what we promised to deliver, we've actually been able to deliver. We've actually been able to realize their value proposition. And once we do that at small scale, we then shift into that final stage where we are in search of that product market fit. And so that's where we're trying to get other parts of that business model, the scalability aspects, to come in, and we've got a product that actually starts to work. So I'm going to take a little break here before I get into this example that I'm going to share with you to see if there are any other questions. And then I'll spend about 5 minutes just sharing one example with you, and then we'll take as many questions as we can before the hour's done. So let me see. Are you an advocate of high-fidelity prototypes and user testing to find the fit solution? That's a great question, and so I will say that I'm an advocate of finding the right fidelity prototype. So sometimes when you're dealing with early adopters, they're happy with the napkin sketch, and they're visionary enough that they can actually visualize what you're going to do, and sometimes you don't even need to show them anything. You might be able to describe the problem to them. But what I found is that more often than not, most customers are not able to actually visualize the full solution, and so it is your job to figure out what that right fidelity is. Sometimes it could be a sketch, sometimes it could be a screenshot, sometimes it could be a video, and sometimes it could even be a prototype of the product, maybe in a demo form that you can show and they can click around with. And so that is sometimes dependent on the kind of product, but more specifically on the customer segments that you're going after, is just how readily are they able to visualize your solution. So let me see one other question. How do you determine at which point on the growth curve you're at? Early adopters, early majority, et cetera. I would say when you're first starting out, our job is really to find early adopters. And there's just no, there's trying to go after the early majority or trying to go after the mainstream customers at this point is a mistake. And part of the reason is that it's very hard to really market a product to kind of a mainstream audience without having some momentum behind you. And so it is hard enough finding early adopters, but once you find early adopters, they're motivated. One is if you are kind of rigorous in that process, it's important to define them as narrowly as possible. So it helps you identify more of them. It helps you identify channels where you might find them. And what you want to do, as Jeffrey Moore kind of describes in his book, Crossing the Chasm, is establish that first beachhead with early adopters. Now, he also describes a chasm that we should all be so lucky that we actually have to cross that chasm one day. But I find that with even just going after early adopters, that is challenging enough, and that should be the initial focus and not really the mainstream audience. And how do you determine what to focus on and build, focus, learn? Yes, that's a good question, and I would say it's very much dependent by the stage you're in. And so I kind of mentioned there are these risks that you inherently have in your canvas. And so one good example of that is for you to really look and see how, as you're creating this canvas, if you leave any blanks, for example, if you don't have any good answers, if you're writing a business plan, you typically go and make up some answers, but here you want to be a little bit more honest. You can make up answers, but you have to kind of gauge and see which ones you're sure about, which ones you're most unsure about. That's one of the ways to actually identify what might be riskiest on your plan. The other way is to actually go and talk to advisors. I find advisors to be a great source for doing some of this early risk assessment, is to go and talk to other people who might have built similar types of products, who might have domain expertise in these areas, and go and articulate your plan to them. Even use the canvas as a helpful guide. And at the end of that, really ask them what they think is riskiest on this plan and where you might want to start your testing. So those are typically some of the ways that you can use to identify what they are. Now, I do also kind of in the book talk about just some universal risks. I find that most products, irrespective of how much domain expertise you may already have bringing in, should always start by doing some validation of the problem risk. So being able to go in front of customers and say, this is the problem I want to solve. Not as much talking about solutions, but these are the problems I want to solve. And being able to get a positive reinforcement from customers typically is one place that I like to encourage people that they start. The other thing is, or the other two would be channels and revenue streams. So again, most people like to defer these things to later, but I find that both of them are hugely risky and they take a lot of time to develop, a lot of time to test. Channels take a lot of time to develop. Pricing is always very tricky. So those are two things that I, again, like to front load in many of the products that I build and try to test them as early as possible. But as I will show you here in a second, sometimes pricing is not as risky as we think it is for certain products. And so I'm actually going to go into this final stage, and I'll come back and answer more questions. But what I'd like to spend a few minutes doing is talking about a case study that hopefully illustrates a lot of these principles that I've kind of talked about using a concrete example. And so the example that I wanted to use was not a software or hardware example, because I know we have a wide group of people in the audience. And I also wanted to pick something that was simple that people could readily understand. And so I picked the example of writing a book, specifically writing this particular book that we're talking about, Running Lean. And so I applied very much the same kind of thought process that I've described to writing this book, and that's what I'm going to illustrate here. So going back to August, September 2009, I was running my company, and I decided that I wanted to start applying or testing some of these lean startup and customer development ideas. So up until now, I had built products using all kinds of different techniques. I had done less is more from the 37 Signal guys. I built lots of features. I built very, very few features. I'd done release early, release often. I'd done a lot of different things in search of this better way for building products. And I stumbled into the works of Eric Ries and Steve Blank, and a lot of it resonated to me from a very practical level, and I wanted to start testing these ideas. As I started to put these things into practice, I found that there were a lot of tactical difficulties that I ran into, and I decided I would just openly blog about it. And that's how I started blogging while I was building my product. Now, along the way, I built up a small audience, and some of them actually started suggesting that I actually turn some of my writings into a book. And so while I was flattered by that, I kind of turned them away and said, while I'm very interested maybe in doing that one day, I'm too busy running my startup. I cannot spend months at a time just doing nothing but writing. I can't go into the mountains and just write a book, which is what people typically do. And so I kind of turned them away. And so that was how that's how the spark of the idea of the book really started. Now, after about 12 to 15 of these kind of requests, I decided to explore a little bit further. So that is the first stage of understanding the problem. And so I set up a call with these 12 people, and I created a teaser page, which looked something like this at the time. And my objective here was not so much to try to sell this book to them, but I really wanted to understand what was it that people wanted in this book. And so I tried in the first place to talk them out of it. I kind of talked about the existing alternatives. And so there were people, there was already lots of content out there. There were blogs and videos that were out there. And so I really asked them if I was to write this book, what it is about the book that would really attract them to this book. And particularly I wanted to create I wanted to test the table of contents. And so I created this table of contents on this teaser page, and I set up these calls, and that was very valuable in being able to refine what was going to go into this book. And so many people were able to articulate some of the things that eventually went in this book, and that was the way that I started to test or define the content for this book. You'll notice I didn't spend a lot of time trying to build up a fancy book cover or even create a fancy title. At first, the title was even something different. It was called Getting Lean, and actually over just further refinement, it got turned into Running Lean. But the tagline, the sub-tagline, I didn't spend a whole lot of time. I really wanted to just get in front of these customers or these potential readers and ask them what about this book they would want to see. And through that process, I was able to refine that table of contents. Now, I also threw out the price here, but this is an example where price was not as risky for me, because if this was going to be a business book, it would be priced about the same as any other business book, and I knew that if the content would be good, people would probably not have a problem paying for it. So price was not as risky. And so after about half a dozen to a dozen of these calls, I got a good sense of what was going to go into this book, and all 12 people said that if I wrote this particular book with this table of contents, they would buy it. For $20, $30, they would buy this book. But at that point, this was still not a problem worth solving for me. Being able to sell a book just to 12 or 20 people was not going to be something that would justify all the time that would go into this. And so what I did then was leave this teaser page up. I actually modified it and added that email collection button where people could register their interest. And I put a coming this summer, and this was back in February at the time. So I was being very optimistic, because I really thought that some of this effort was going to be a cut and paste job from my blog, and maybe easy enough for me to do if I really got my head around it. But that's how I did this. And so I left this teaser page up, and I did nothing for a while. I kind of just went away and went back to running my startup. Now, at about I would say toward the end of summer, I had 1,000 people on that mailing list said they would be willing to buy that book if I wrote it. And at that point, this became a problem that was now worth solving for me. And the way that I determined that was just doing a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation, saying if I sold 1,000 books, it would at least make it worthwhile of spending 2 or 3 months, part-time writing this book. And so that was my initial kind of thinking around that. And so at that point, I started to take the book seriously for the first time. Well, I was taking it seriously, but in the sense of actually wanting to write the first chapter. And as I started to do it, I realized that a lot of the thinking had changed along the way, and this was not an easy book to write because so much of it had been evolving along the way. And so what I did instead was create my version of the minimum viable product. So rather than spending time writing this book by myself, I decided to test the content with other people. And so in Austin, which is where I live, I announced a free lean startup, / customer development workshop, which I call Running Lean. And I had 30 people register for it. They were interested to actually join. Now, I didn't take all 30 of them up front because that's another principle that we talk about in Lean Startup. It's one of testing in small batches. So rather than testing all 30 up front, I broke them into 3 cohorts or 3 batches of 10 each. So that way, if the first one bombed miserably, I could then go back and test this at least 2 more times. And so I kind of picked that initial batch of 10. I did a free workshop with them. And at the end of it, people were so happy with the workshop, many of them said they would have actually happily paid for this workshop. And so I did some price testing with them, and sure enough, I started charging for these workshops after that, which is another test, is that if you're actually trying to build a product that you may eventually sell, it's actually a good tactic to first try to give away the product for free and see if anyone will really take it. And then at some point you have to do some price testing. And so that's where the paid workshops came in, and that's how I started to test the pricing of this content. Now, along the way, I was constantly refining the content through slides. I was not writing the book. I was just using slides to constantly refine the book. Summer had come and gone. It was fall by now, and some of the earlier readers were starting to get antsy because I had promised this book in the summer, and they were asking, where is this book? And what I told them is that writing this book was much harder than I originally thought. And so what I'm going to do instead is I made a deal with them where I would write this book much like I would write software. So I would write it incrementally in 2-chapter increments. And so I went back to that teaser page and I changed the call to action button. I actually put a pre-order button there, gave a little discount, which going back now I probably would not have even done, because when I polled the early adopters later, price was never really a concern, and they would have bought this book at full price if that's what I'd asked them to do. But what was interesting, though, is that when I put this out there, only about half the people actually pulled the trigger and did the pre-order. The other half decided to wait for the complete book because they didn't want to read something that was partial. But many of them really cited things like print, a print version for the book, or a Kindle version, iBook version of the book, because they didn't like the PDF format that I was going to release the book in. And that is a good qualifier for even further identifying who your early adopters are. So my early adopters for the book were people who wanted to get the book in this incremental, piecemeal fashion in whatever format was most convenient. They were not as interested in the packaging of the final product, which is still important. And those were things to me that were easily achievable if I wanted to do them at that point, but that was not where the risk lied. The risk really lied in writing a good book, not so much in designing the best book cover or even in coming up with the right formats for other people. And so that's kind of something that I wanted to share there of how you actually might pick early adopters or be able to qualify your early adopters. Now, these 2-week release cycles were actually very helpful in helping me to refine this book along the way. So because I was doing these things in these small batches, it was very easy to take 2 chapters at a time, put it out there, get feedback, come back and review them, and incorporate those changes. So the entire flow of the book got improved, illustrations got improved, a lot of the content got so much better because of this process. And along the way, something interesting happened. Towards the end of that year, I got contacted by a publisher who had not only seen what I'd been doing, but they'd actually downloaded the preview version of the book, or actually the current version of the book, which was probably 3/4 of the way done. And they were actually interested not in reviewing the book, but in actually publishing it as is, which to me was a little bit surprising at first, but when I thought about it, it made a lot of sense. My first reaction was, why would they want to publish a book that's been released as a PDF? Because it's been out there. I've leaked it several times. It's been distributed as a PDF. Who knows how many copies are floating around. But one thing that I learned is that they were interested in the book because a lot of the risk of writing a book had been de-risked over time, and this became a book that was interesting to them at that point. So that's where and once that was done, I then went on and completed the book in February the following year. And at that point went back and came up with the first edition. So this is not what the current book looks like. This is the first edition of the book where I went back and designed a more better-looking landing page. Went back to the early adopters, got testimonials, did book covers, all of the things that you would typically do with a product. But those were not things that I started with. Those were things that I kind of backed into later on. And then once the book was finished, the process of iteration really continued on. I've continued to write on my blog. I've continued to teach workshops, which have become in some ways a product of their own. And all of those learnings have helped to fuel kind of a new set of ideas, a new set of changes, which are now reflected in the new updated book that's now coming out as an O'Reilly title, which is the Running Lean second edition. And so at this point, I'll kind of pause here, or I'll kind of stop here with this first webcast and see if we've got 3 or 4 minutes left. See if there are any other questions that you guys might have that I can answer.
Hi, Ash. It's Yasmina. Thank you so much for that outstanding presentation. We do actually have several more questions that have come in from the audience. If you do have a second to refresh your Q&A chat, you will see some of the new ones that came in. And folks, please, while we still have Ash with us, send in those questions to the group chat. We'll see if there's enough time to answer them. And back to you.
All right. So I'm going to try to be as short as I can with these questions. So how should one determine the price? So pricing is always a very tricky thing, and so I would say that the best place to start is by an understanding of who your customers are and what their existing alternatives are today. So if they're already paying for a product, if they're already paying for something to solve the problem that you're doing, having an understanding of what that is at least sets some price anchors that you can use to position your price against. So that's usually a good way to start that initial price testing. Now you may want to definitely explore if you want to price higher, if you're a premium product, or lower, depending on what your value proposition ends up being. But just having an understanding of what they do today is a good way to set those price anchors. Let's see. How important are final projections? Any guidelines for bootstrapping a product? So I would say that when you start out with any product, it's important to have the end in mind. So the whole concept here is that we're trying to build products that are successful. We're trying to build companies that are successful. But at the same point, those are all hypotheses that have to be tested. So I'm not as interested in final projections that are 3 or 5 years out. But if I know that I'm going after a market that is big enough and that I can readily address, I'm looking more for a grounds-up approach on how can I increase my reach into that market. How can I build channels incrementally over time to be able to capture a more realistic share of that market versus starting with these projections, which may be just fictitious, top-down type of thinking. Let's see. If your product creates a new market, would you advise rigorously applying the Running Lean flow? If not, what modifications would you suggest? So that's a great question. Definitely when you're in a new, the first thing I would say is really question if you are in a new market or not. So many people look at devices like the iPad that Apple launched, and they would say that was a brand new category, a brand new product. But the problems it was solving were age-old. I mean, there were lots of products out there that were already doing a lot of things that the iPad did. And so even though it was a new product in a new category and it was a new market, it was solving problems for which there were existing alternatives. So many times that's where I would start, is really try to understand what those alternatives are. But if you are indeed in a new market, typically that requires a lot of resource, a lot of education in getting customers to want to recognize that this is a product, this is a problem they have. If you're in that situation, I would say that the bigger risk is going to be trying to identify how you're going to do that. So even the interviewing process can still be very helpful in kind of seeing what obstacles you might have to overcome. But that's, again, where things like channels and things like just that proper articulation of the problem, the identification of who the early adopters might be, become more a priority than in any other type of product for which there may be an existing market. All right, let's see. On a problem solution fit in enterprise software, we're introducing a new product, doing a lot of interviews, but the problem looks different to many people, CEO, COO, director of production, that take part in the buying process. How do you reconcile? So if you haven't read Steve Blank's book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, I would say that's a great book for that particular type of product, because Steve Blank very much covers the enterprise software market and talks about this problem specifically, is that when you're dealing with this multi-step buying process, many times it might even be helpful to create multiple canvases for each of those audiences and figure out what that value articulation needs to be, what that value proposition needs to be. Because one of the examples he gives in his book is how they presented a product to the CIOs, and when they went to the IT folks, they were kicked out of the room because they didn't address basic security concerns. And so it's very important to kind of identify who those players are, what those user roles are in your particular product, and kind of tackle them systematically. Okay, let's see. So someone's asking, it's a long question, but he has a great idea. He's dependent on people for the same, and he has to present his plan to a client. How should he go about doing that? For example, a person has a tool, and I want to use this tool to integrate the same way with my app. So to me, it's more about how to present your plan to the client. And so again, in the book, I have the scripts that I particularly used for the problem interviews as well as the solution interviews. And while that might not work for every one of you, it's still a good example to look at. And I would almost say that the first step is really understanding what your client has as a problem, and so being able to articulate what that is, understanding how they solve that problem today, and then putting together some kind of a demo at the right fidelity that you can use to demonstrate how you're going to solve that problem. Okay, do you treat service products and the development of widgets the same way? Why or why not? So, yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think that when you're, so I would almost say it depends on what your value proposition with the service is. So to me, if your value proposition is about delivering kind of the end value to customers, then I find very little distinction between building a physical product versus building a service product, because in the end you still have to address the basic needs. You have to know who your customers are. You have to know what their motivations are, what they are looking to achieve with your product. So if you're just doing if it's a one-off service, then it's maybe a different situation. But I think if you're trying to deliver kind of this long-term recurring value to customers, I find these principles to still apply the same way.